Good afternoon or good evening, everybody. This is Definition, our next purpose for college writing. Now, at its most basic, definition is simple, defining what something is. Now, there are a couple of types of definition. The first is the formal definition. The formal definition is the simple, basic, succinct definition. It's what you'd find in the dictionary. For example, I have my phone here and the word freedom has been Googled. I Googled the word freedom definition. What I have is that it's a noun, and it's the power or right to speak, act, or think as one wants without hindrance or restraint. Basic. That's all it is. That's what it means. It's just boring. It's just a denotation. That's all it is. It's the kind of stuff you learn when you were little kids. What we want is what the extended definition is. And what the extended definition is something that gets at what something's essential nature might be. The word freedom might just mean the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants, but what does it really mean? What is the extended definition of that word? And that's what the definition purpose really does. When you want to get at something that requires a paragraph or an essay or even an entire book, you start to look at the extended definition. You get to something much more interesting to read. So there are ways to use formal definitions. It's good as an introduction to a much larger definition. For example, the word altruism. I'm very curious what the word altruism means, so I'm going to Google it right now. And so here we are, we've Googled it. It's a noun, the belief in or the practice of disinterested and selfless concern for the well-being of others. That is a great introduction to something else. By itself, doesn't give us much. So if you look in the dictionary, you find something like this and you think, so what? Here's where you get the worth, the extended definition. It's where you start to look at patterns of development, which we're going to be getting to in just a few minutes here, and we start to think in terms of deeper ideas. How can we explain what altruism is? Not by giving you the dictionary definition, but by explaining it in action, its essential nature. So let's think about development. The first type of development that we can use, for example, if we want to explain altruism or freedom, is something called exemplification, which is something we're going to hit later. It is a very simple purpose in writing, and it's one that you probably already know just off the top of your head. It's simply the idea of giving examples. Maybe to define what altruism is, I give examples of altruistic behavior. Or maybe to define freedom, I give examples of things that one can do when they are free. If I'm going to use description, on the other hand, I'm going to describe it. I can describe altruism by explaining the qualities of what it is to be altruistic, perhaps. Maybe the behavior of somebody who is altruistic. If I were to describe something like a cell, if I were to define what a cell is, in a human body, maybe I would go through and describe what it looks like and include diagrams and show the membranes and all that goodness. Or maybe I want to do compare-contrast. An extended definition can be very beneficial with compare-contrast. And in fact, after having understood this purpose, you can probably go back and find that many of the authors and speakers that we've seen so far use definition. They define concepts. The article that we read, the first article, the Black Table, is still there. It uses definition. He defines segregation. And he uses it through compare and contrast. He creates an argument, he compares, he contrasts. Or maybe you want to do something called process. A process is really simple. A process is you explain the process of how to do something, or a process of how something comes to be. A process explanation would be a definition purpose where you would trace the process of something from stage to stage. You also might use it to define what an object is. Maybe you define it in terms of what it does, the process of using it. Maybe you define freedom by defining the process of becoming free. And lastly, classification and division. This one is for you science kids. Classification and division is going to be most useful by basing your definition on models, where you perhaps, to go away from science, obviously, because I'm not a science guy. If I wanted to define authority, maybe I would classify and divide by saying the different types of authority. Maybe I would give a paragraph on traditional authority or charismatic authority or legal bureaucratic authority. If I were to define a dictatorship, maybe I would spend some time talking about different types of dictatorships and how they are different from one another. And yes, there is some process of compare and contrast in there as well. Now, with structure always has, again, an argumentative thesis. You always have those principles of argumentation at work, where you seek to create a thesis statement which is a focus for your essay, argues something to be true. And it tells your readers, in the case of definition, your own approach to the definition. So your introduction has to identify what the term is, and that's where that denotation comes in handy, and maybe presents that formal definition, and goes on to state your essay's thesis. Your body of the essay would expand on the definition, including one or several of those patterns that we talked about in the previous examples, such as process or compare, contrast, or exemplification. You can use many of them. Now, in addition to this, in addition to those purposes, you can also expand the body of your essay in a series of simple strategies. Those strategies are that of synonyms, negation, enumeration, analogies, or origin and development. Synonyms would be to define a word by defining words of similar meanings or concepts of similar meanings. You can also define a term with negation, perhaps by saying what it is not. So if I were to use freedom for either of these two examples, maybe I would define freedom through synonyms by giving examples of things that are like freedom. If I were to use negation, maybe I would use examples of what is not freedom. You can also do enumeration, and enumeration is by listing its characteristics and the qualities of those characteristics. Or I could define a term using the analogies with comparisons that identify similarities between the term and something dissimilar. Again, you see some compare and contrast in that. And lastly, I could use origin and development. This one is the one that's not for everybody, but it does have a very valid purpose, and that is you can talk about where the word comes from. You can chart its history. What was its original meaning? When you think of that word freedom, where does that word come from? Who used it? Why was it used? How has it changed its meaning over the years? Now, if you're using a definition essay, it can also be really useful to use a visual within all of this. Maybe a drawing or a painting or a diagram or a photograph or a still clip from a movie that maybe shows a little bit of what you're talking about. And then, of course, finally, you have your conclusion, which is just to remind your readers why you've chosen to define the term, maybe restating your thesis. There's also, within all of this, of course, elements of narrative, which we're going to be getting to very shortly. So, again, as a recap, if you need what to know to write down: synonyms, define a term or an idea by using its synonyms; negation, what it is not; enumeration, list and define; analogies, comparisons; origin and development, derivation. So if you need to take those notes, pause here. So we have a few checkpoints here, just like we do with the other videos. The revision checklist on page 511, it's a nice little bit, and it's a handy thing to decide, is this a division essay or is this a definition essay? Am I doing it properly? For example, does the assignment call for definition? Does the essay have a thesis that defines that term that you're going to define? Not all definition essays will have that definition in the term, and those are what I like to call hybrid essays. It's just a fancy way of saying you're blending purposes, and definition just happens to be one of the purposes. But to be a true definition essay, you always make sure to define what your word or idea is in your introduction. We also have editing guidelines, pages 511 to 512. And again, you can go back in your textbook, which is why I have you with that textbook, on pages 71, 74, and 76, and there are some great guidelines on editing in there. We also have grammar and context, which is avoiding is when and is where. This is the, for example, freedom is when you do this, or freedom is where you do this, and it gives you some handy tips on how to avoid that sloppy writing. We also have our student writer, written by Ajoy Matab for a composition course, and it defines what the untouchables are. I highly recommend you read this essay. The untouchables are members of a caste that are shunned in India. Now, in his essay, Ajoy, he grew up in Calcutta, and he presents his thesis, which is very critical of the practice of ostracizing the untouchables. He also includes a photograph, and it's really handy for you to look at the photograph as well as read the essay.